The Assassins of Alamut. Who were the assassins? Assassins and assassination are, regrettably, very much with us today. Our heads of government must be protected by elaborate security day and night, while the rest of us in many parts of the world are constantly at risk of being caught up in the fanaticism of zealots of one kind or another who feel it justifiable or even meritorious to kill innocent bystanders. Assassination as a political weapon is no doubt as old as organized human society, but the word itself is of medieval origin and refers to the activities of a Persian sect who were popularly supposed to drug themselves by means of hashish, whence the name. But who were the original assassins, and what did they believe about themselves? These are fascinating questions, whose interest is not confined to politics or history. The ramifications extend to religion, mysticism, and ideas about the millennium. The assassins were a heretical Islamic sect. They were a potent source of myth and legends. This emerges in an imaginative account written by Marco Polo, who visited the site of their castle at Alamut in Iran just after its destruction by the Mongols. He repeats the legend of how the future assassins were supposedly prepared for their missions by being drugged with hashish, brought into a secret pleasure garden, and told they had visited paradise, to which they would return if they were killed in action. By the time Marco Polo reached Alamut, the prevailing view of the sect as supremely wicked yet dangerously alluring was already well established in people's minds. Alamut was already well past its heyday when it fell to the Mongols, but the legend of depravity and license had arisen much earlier, when the castle was the center of a widespread and, from the Orthodox point of view, most dangerous heresy. Even before Marco Polo, the West had encountered the assassins through their Syrian branch, which was known to the Crusaders. The great contemporary historian of the Crusades, William of Tyre, had written about them in a way that reveals a fair amount of understanding, and a remarkable embassy had gone from them to the King of Jerusalem, offering their conversion to Christianity. At one time, the Syrian assassins were in loose alliance with the Franks against Saladin, whom they attempted more than once to murder, though later, and especially after the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin in 1187, they took part in the Muslim struggle against the Franks. In 1192, Conrad of Montferrat was murdered by men disguised as monks, and it is generally supposed that these were assassins, though the English King Richard I has also been suspected of instigating the murder. From this time on, it seems, the Crusaders, already severely demoralized by the loss of Jerusalem, became more fearful of the assassins, to whom they ascribed devilish cunning, a mastery of disguise, and a knowledge of various Frankish languages. Count Henry of Champagne paid a visit to the assassins in 1194, and is supposed to have witnessed a remarkable display of loyalty on behalf of the followers of the Old Man of the Mountain. This is another misconception. Old Man is a literal translation of the Persian word pir, which here means sheikh or master. While walking together in the castle one day, Henry and the assassin chief began to talk of obedience. Some youths in white were sitting on top of a high tower. "I will show you what obedience is," the chief said. He gave a sign, and immediately two of the youths leapt from the tower and were dashed to pieces at the foot of the rock. Stories such as these made up the legend of the assassins that persisted in the West until quite recently. In the 19th century, a Viennese amateur historian called von Hammer-Purgstall wrote a book about the assassins, in which he ascribed to them, if not quite every conceivable form of infamy, at least most of those that could be openly referred to in print at the time. Whenever more than one possible interpretation of a statement or event existed, von Hammer automatically preferred the one that showed the assassins in the worst possible light. His motive in writing seems to have been as much to emphasize the wickedness of all secret societies, including the Jesuits and Freemasons of his day, as to make a historical study of the assassins, and his book has little historical value. Nevertheless, it remained the standard reference work on the sect as late as the 1930s, when Freya Stark went to Alamut. Since that time, however, much new information has come to light, some of it material preserved by descendants of the assassins themselves. This has been extensively studied and edited by the Russian scholar W. Ivanov, who apparently has had access to a large number of documents and manuscripts that are not generally available. The other main authority on the sect is the American M.S. Hodgson. From all this modern scholarship has emerged a picture of the assassins, which, if it lacks some of the lurid qualities of the legend, has at least the merit of credibility. Moreover, the truth turns out to be more enthralling than the fiction. No longer can we believe in the old man of the mountain hatching his evil plots and sending forth his murderous emissaries drugged with hashish. Such a state of mind hardly seems compatible with the legendary accomplishments of the assassins, their superlative cunning, patience, knowledge of languages, and so forth. And in any case, our modern experience of terrorism does not suggest that its perpetrators require any narcotic stronger than fanaticism itself. Besides, if the claims of modern users of hashish are to be believed, the effects of the drug tend more towards pacificism than murderousness. But there is no real evidence that the assassins used hashish at all, at least for this purpose. The term Hashshashin, from which our word assassin very probably derives, was not used by members of the sect themselves, but was a nickname applied by their enemies. Even so, it was not in common use. The usual names for the assassins were esotericists, Batinis, Ismailis, or Nizaris. The real story of the assassins contains several fascinating elements. First, there is the use of political murder, which is what the sect is chiefly remembered for today. Then there is their complex philosophy, which guided their development and culminated in the extraordinary proclamation of the resurrection at Alamut. This in turn was followed by the tragedy of the destruction of Alamut by the Mongols. Yet, amazingly, this was not the end for the assassins, for they were reborn as the Khojas in India. The Aga Khan is the lineal descendant of the rulers of Alamut. This is the story that I tell in this book, A Visit to Alamut, 1966. I first heard of the assassins many years ago when I read Freya Stark's classic travel book, The Valley of the Assassins. Probably because she was such a remarkable writer, the notion of the assassins lodged in my mind, so it was natural that when I later found myself living in Iran, I should think of making a journey to see the assassin's stronghold for myself. In 1966, I did so. It was, of course, a much easier expedition for me, even in 1966, than it had been for Freya Stark 35 years earlier. It was also easier than it would be today, though for different reasons. In 1930, Freya Stark had to make the whole journey on foot, but in 1966, a road of sorts went at least part of the way, though there was still a half-day's walk to reach the castle from the road. Even in 1966, not many people went there, however, and it was difficult to discover much reliable information in advance, so that a little of the spirit of discovery still attended the project. Indeed, shortly after I went, I was followed by no less august a traveler than Wilfrid Thesiger, who was passing through Iran on his way to some more adventurous journey. Thesiger no doubt regarded his visit to the castle as little more than a pleasant stroll, whereas for me it was a major undertaking. Unlike Freya Stark, and thanks largely to the sketch map in my ancient penguin copy of her book, which accompanied me, I at least knew exactly where the valley lay. It is set among the mountains at the western edge of the Alborz range, between the plain of Kazvin in the south and the province of Mazandaran, bordering the Caspian Sea to the north. In earlier times, a part of these mountains formed the district of Dalam, which was, and still is, remote and wild. They separate the central Iranian plain from the Caspian, and they are a formidable barrier, with passes at about 10,000 feet. On the south side, the mountains are dry and barren, with scattered oases of cultivation. On the north side, you enter a different world, where the slopes are densely forested. Wild animals, boar, bear, leopard, are still to be found there today, and in medieval times must have been much commoner. The main castle of the Assassins lies in the Alamut Valley, on a tribute of the Alamut River near a village called Qasir Khan. I had been told that there were lorries that carried paraffin from Qazvin to the mountain villages. They called it Sharak at the head of the valley, and from there it was about 6 hours' walk to reach Qasir Khan. My plan was to visit the castle AMD, then to go on northwards over the mountains and down through the forest to the Caspian. I knew no one who had done this, but it looked quite feasible on the map. My equipment consisted of a backpack in which I carried some spare clothes and emergency rations, and also a sleeping bag and an aerial survey map of the mountains kindly lent me by a friend in the U.S. Embassy. The map was not really detailed enough for my purpose, but it was all I had since Freya Stark had not continued on the route I intended to follow. I relied on being able to get local advice. I took the bus from Tehran and got off a few miles from Qazvin at the point where a dirt road led north towards the distant mountains. There, I waited most of the day, but no lorry came by. In the afternoon, therefore, I took a bus into Qazvin and made inquiries. No one admitted to knowing anything about lorries. A man offered to take me into the mountains by jeep, but named an absurdly inflated price. I was standing disconsolately in the street, on the point of giving up, when a small boy appeared from a shoemaker's shop nearby and invited me in for tea. I explained my problem to the proprietor. He turned out to be a friend of a man who owned a fleet of lorries and said he would take me to him. So matters were arranged, and at last I started from Qazvin, sitting between the driver and his mate. It was nearly evening. Soon we had crossed the dusty plain and were climbing the first range of hills on our way to the Chala Pass, on a dirt road that wound in hairpins so tight that we frequently had to reverse several times to get round them. By now it was dark. In our headlights, flocks of jerboas skipped like tiny kangaroos, and once we saw an animal I did not recognize, but which the driver said was valued for its pelt. A swooping rush down the far side of the pass, and we arrived at the village of Chala. Here my journey almost ended before it had properly begun. We stopped to eat at a coffee house. This is a ubiquitous Iranian institution, at which, despite its name, tea and not coffee is served. It fulfills the function of a meeting place for the local male population, much like the Greek Caphanion. This one was in a hollow filled with tall poplars that shut out the moon. In the inky darkness, I stepped over a 4-foot drop and landed awkwardly, spraining my right ankle. 2 hours later, it was swollen, and I could hardly walk. At first, I was sure I should have to give up the journey, but I was reluctant to do so, having planned it for so long and knowing that I was due to leave Iran shortly and would never have another chance. I therefore decided to wait until next morning and make a final decision about continuing then. Soon after setting off again in the lorry, we came to the confluence of the Talakan and Alamut rivers, where they unite to form the Shah River. Here the road ended for a time, and we drove up the bed of the Alamut River through water a couple of feet deep. At Badasht, a village further up the river, we lay down to sleep on the veranda of another coffee house. Unsuccessfully, so far as I was concerned, owing to the clouds of mosquitoes. After a couple of hours, we went on. The lorry now broke down and had to be repaired by torchlight amid another cloud of mosquitoes. The driver remarked accurately that we were being made into kebabs. We eventually reached Sharak, my destination, at 3 o'clock in the morning. Here I slept until dawn under a large communal mosquito net. At first light, I examined my ankle. It was still very swollen, but I thought I could walk on it, so I set off. And in fact, I managed to complete the whole journey as planned, without undue discomfort, and subsequently the ankle healed without permanent ill effects. This experience taught me that the standard conventional treatments in vogue at the time, namely strapping and rest, were not essential or possibly even desirable, a view that is being increasingly adopted by casualty doctors today. For several hours, my path lay beside the Alamut River in the main Alamut Valley, which is about a mile broad and contains many rice paddies whose brilliant green stood out vividly against the red soil. At one point, I was supposed to cross the river by means of a bridge consisting merely of two more or less parallel and very flexible poles, but this seemed too ambitious for my insecure ankle, burdened as I was by a fairly heavy pack, so I looked for a ford and found one a little higher up. After about 4 hours walking, I reached a village called Shotur Khan and turned north up the tributary that led to Qasir Khan, which I reached after another 2 hours hard walking. Qasir Khan was a pleasant village, bordered by orchards and built, like the others in the district, of flat-roofed houses on top of which people were winnowing grain. Just behind the village rises the rock itself, about 800 feet high and an imposing sight, but dwarfed by the great mass of Mount Haudagan behind. As you approach the rock from the south, you get a clear impression of its near impregnability. Little of the scanty remaining ruins can be seen from below, but traces of a curious channel running transversely across the southern face can be made out, while just below the top is a patch of green, the so-called vine of Hassan-i Sabbah. The present-day inhabitants of Qasir Khan are not the descendants of the Assassins, who were either killed or scattered by the Mongols and later replaced by settlers imported from elsewhere. Were it not for foreign visitors to the site, indeed, it is doubtful if they would ever have heard of their illustrious predecessors. They were friendly and made me welcome, and in the afternoon a youth called Ali, together with a friend, took me up to see the rock. As we approached, a large monitor lizard scuttled across the flank of the massif. Ali's friend threw a stone at it but missed. To climb the rock, we went up to the left and round behind to gain access by the neck, which joins it to the main mass of Mount Haudagan. This involved a rather perilous scramble along a shaly slope above some unpleasant-looking rocks. A strong wind was blowing, and as we approached, the neck stones fell from above. It was rather like what I imagine it must be when one is under fire. We gained the summit uninjured, however, and walked about inspecting fragments of wall and innumerable pottery shards. Ali's friend, who wanted to show off, kept running down the treacherous slopes, pulling up, shouting with laughter at the very brink, and calling to me to do likewise, much to the dismay of Ali, who no doubt had no wish to find himself obliged to explain the death of a foreigner to the authorities. At the western end of the rock, there was, as I knew from Freya Stark's account, a cistern that was invisible from above and which she had wisely not tried to reach. Rashly, I asked if it was possible to climb down to it. I was assured that it was, and a few minutes later I found myself clinging with sweaty palms and soles to the walls of a shallow gully, inclined at some 45 degrees or more over an 800-foot drop to the tiny patchwork rice fields below. Only now did I realize quite how minute was the ledge at the foot of the gully, which was all that could prevent me catapulting off into space. When at last I stood rather shakily on level ground again, I asked my guides if anyone ever fell off. They both laughed at the idea, but then Ali added as an afterthought, "Actually, there was one fall this year, but it was only a woman." The cistern was now within easy reach a short way to our right, but first Ali's friend insisted on looking for grapes on the vine of Hassan-i Sabbah. This grew nearby in a cranny, but to reach it involved crossing several feet of utterly smooth rock that slanted at about 70 degrees. Even Ali felt that this was a little risky, but his friend was eager to impress the foreigner and insisted on performing the exploit. He returned safely, to my relief, but naturally, there were no grapes. The cistern was enclosed in an oblong excavation and was about the size of a small swimming pool. Here was the opportunity to recover a little lost ground. I suggested a swim. Ali was horrified. The pool, he said, was bottomless. Nevertheless, I was firm, and disregarding a few water beetles and the rather uninviting greenish color of the water, I got in and swam a couple of lengths. Ali's friend, not to be outdone, followed my example. However, I seemed to have set some kind of record, and I was glad to find, on returning to the village, that Ali related my remarkable feat of daring with suitable expressions of awe. Returning to the summit, we sat at the mouth of a tunnel cut through a rib of rock and looked out over the Alamut Valley, just as Hassan-i Sabbah must often have done. They say some people came from Tehran once and dug up treasure here, lots of gold and jewels, Ali said. He paused and then added sadly, "But I think it's all lies myself. What do you say?" Back in the village, I discussed the prospects for going on to the Caspian. The route, it seemed, was quite straightforward provided one knew it, but there was general agreement I could not manage it alone. My pack was too heavy, and if clouds should come down, it would be easy to lose the way. Why did I want to go anyway? I had expected this question. The villagers were used to the idea of visitors coming to see the rock. This happened every 2 or 3 years, but no one had ever gone on over the mountains. Why should I want to? I could think of no convincing answer. We tend to forget how recent a historical phenomenon is our modern appreciation of wilderness. To these villagers, as to most people before the Romantic era, mountains were mere obstacles, not something to be enjoyed for their own sake. My feeble protestations that I found the country beautiful and wanted see more of it were not believed for a moment, but the villagers were too polite to press me. I heard one of them say, "He must have some reason of his own for going." I imagine they thought I was a spy. I couldn't follow all the discussion in any case, because this was a mainly Turkish-speaking area. After a good deal of discussion, it was agreed that Ali's elder brother Mehdi should take his mule and guide me as far as the pass, from which I should have an easy walk to the first village on the north side of the range. We were to start as soon as the moon rose, at about 2 o'clock in the morning. I lay down to sleep until it was time to leave, but was kept awake by an army of fleas as numerous and bloodthirsty as the Mongol hordes that captured Alamut from the Assassins, so that I was glad when it was time to start. We climbed past the rock and up through a dreamlike moonlit world of cool gray and black in what seemed like a different landscape from the yellows and reds I had sweated through by day. We went fast, and the altitude made my breath come short and my heart race. Sooner than I expected, the stars began to fade. As dawn broke, we paused at a little grove of poplars beside a spring. The water was so cold it made my bones ache. The sun rose and burnt my skin through the thin air. I began to understand why we were going so fast. Mehdi was charging me for 2 days, but he intended to get back in one. We stopped on the way to sleep for an hour, but by 10 o'clock, 2 hours earlier than Mehdi had estimated, we were at the pass. Here we met a man wearing rubber boots and carrying an umbrella, an incongruous sight, for it was blazingly hot on the south side of the range. But Mazandaran to the north is a region of heavy rainfall even in summer. I took my pack from the mule, said goodbye to Mehdi, resisting his request that I should give him my shirt, and set off downhill. On a slope to my left were the black tents of nomads. Women in brightly colored dresses were uttering piercing cries to marshal their goats. To my right was a bank of snow several feet thick, from which sprang the river I was to follow down to the sea that lay, still hidden under a bank of blue air, some 10,000 feet lower and 30 miles distant. The intervening gap was filled by forests, in which lay a little white lens-shaped cloud. This, I was to discover, hovered over the first village on the north side. I reached this towards evening and found it to be surrounded by rushing waters, the source, no doubt, of the overhanging white cloud. Here I ate a meal, surrounded by curious villagers who plied me with questions, and then fell thankfully into a deep sleep. Next day I set off, on horseback, with a group of some 30 people bound for the Caspian. I reached the coast in the afternoon and found a minivan that was returning to Tehran. The drive back through the mountains, during which the driver frequently overtook other vehicles on blind bends, was much the most dangerous part of the whole journey. It was a memorable trip, and I was very glad to have made it, for it gave me a feeling for the assassins and their country which I could never have obtained from books alone. Certainly, it served to stimulate still further my interest in their extraordinary story. Hassan-i Sabbah. In the year 1080 CE, a man called Hassan was seeking for converts in the Iranian city of Isfahan. He was an Ismaili missionary or propagandist, and a very successful one, who was making converts throughout the northwest of Iran. But this success had made him a marked man. The authorities were in pursuit of him, and the vizier Nizam al-Mulk himself had given orders for his arrest, for the Ismailis were regarded as revolutionary and subversive. What kind of man was Hassan? The Ismaili missionary was a very special person. He was intensively trained in Ismaili doctrine and was expected to lead an exemplary life so as to attract people through his piety. Any shortcomings in the missionary would not only put off potential converts, but would be a threat to the very existence of the organization. He was expected to take great pains with his own spiritual advancement, punishing himself when he behaved badly and rewarding himself if he did well. He behaved in a similar manner towards the people for whom he was responsible. He had to be skilled in a number of professions: carpenter, sailor, oculist, and so forth, so that he could earn his living and also have a cover for his activities, for being an Ismaili missionary was dangerous. It must have been something like being a Catholic priest in England in penal times. The missionary must have a deep knowledge of both the exoteric and the esoteric aspects of religion. In character, he must be kindly and compassionate, modest, reasonable, noble, generous, and truthful. He must have an outstanding intellectual capacity, be capable of keeping secrets, and be an agreeable companion, with a noble soul to lend dignity to his manner, and to attract people to him and allow him to get on with them. He should associate only with ascetic and religious men, and have nothing to do with the dissolute. He must not fool about or tell dirty jokes or use bad language. In short, he was expected to be a paragon of every conceivable virtue, and it is permissible to doubt if any such individuals actually existed. However, at least we know what constituted the Ismaili ideal, and Hassan in particular seems to have embodied a good deal of it. In recompense for the high demands made of him, the missionary was given a good deal of authority over his flock. But this, too, was a source of possible spiritual danger, and he was forbidden to use his position for his own advantage or to show favoritism. He was expected to be an affectionate but impartial father figure. In all of this, his role was that of the imam writ small, for he was the imam's representative and vicar on earth. In order to preach the gospel, the missionary would settle in a town and practice some profession from among his stock of skills, meanwhile building up a local reputation for probity and piety. Gradually, he would gather round him a circle of followers, among whom he would seek the men who seemed most apt to receive new ideas. The missionary would lead up to these ideas cautiously and obliquely, always ready to change the subject if people grew suspicious or hostile. He would speak of religion as a hidden science, and would ask questions such as, why are there 7 cervical and 12 dorsal vertebrae? Why has the face 7 apertures but the rest of the body only 2? These questions were designed to focus the listeners' minds on the idea that the universe is a magnified man, and man is the universe in miniature. The number 7 is particularly important in the Ismaili scheme. See below. As his audience began to respond, the missionary would grow bolder and begin to hint that spiritual salvation depended on pondering these matters and reaching a true understanding of them. When at last he found a man ready to take the step of becoming an Ismaili, the missionary would administer an oath of allegiance. The neophyte promised his loyalty and undertook to pay a financial contribution, and he swore never to divulge the Ismaili secrets to any unauthorized person. Becoming an Ismaili, therefore, was a solemn business, and was much more than merely giving assent to a series of religious propositions. It was an initiation into a secret society. which might well make the convert liable to considerable danger, but also opened for him the path to salvation. Most historians of Ismailism seem to think that initiation was entirely a matter of imparting esoteric doctrines about the interpretation of the Quran and similar matters, but there may have been more to it than that. There are close parallels between Ismaili and Sufi initiation ceremonies, and in the case of Sufism, at least, the esoteric knowledge included instruction in meditation techniques. Such techniques are generally passed on orally. This is true not only of Sufism, but also of Hinduism and Mahayana Buddhism. It is therefore very likely that techniques of this kind were taught during the Ismaili initiation ceremony. There is an early Ismaili book which gives a novelistic account of the conversion and initiation of a young man. Meditation instruction is not mentioned openly, but one page is written in a cipher, which is quite different from that used in many books dating from the Fatimid period. So far, no one has managed to break it, but it is tempting to guess that it contains highly esoteric meditation instruction. The Ismaili initiation procedure provoked a lot of hostile comment from the Ismailis' enemies, who claimed that candidates were led step by step to the ultimate abandonment of all religious belief and moral restraint. The Ismailis were also accused of having mercenary motives, for, according to their critics, the level to which an adept could rise in the hierarchy was determined not by his knowledge, but by how much he was prepared to pay. However, the real nature of Ismaili initiation was rather different. It proceeded at a pace which was not the same for everyone, but depended on the aptitude of the pupil. There were several stages, which were symbolized in physiological terms derived from contemporary theories of embryology, the idea being that the spiritual development of the candidate paralleled that of his earlier development in the womb. The candidate had to swear an elaborate oath, promising loyalty, obedience, and the preservation of secrecy about Ismail doctrines, under pain of terrible retribution if he reneged on his obligation. All this is oddly reminiscent of modern Masonic initiation. Should he default, God would abandon him in this world and the next, and he would be left to his own devices. Altogether, there were many more threats of retribution than promises of felicity, and the general tone was uncompromising and tough. Candidates for initiation would have needed to be serious and determined. To ensure this, of course, was the purpose of the oath. There is certainly no hint of future licentiousness to draw the candidate into the Ismaili fold, nor is there any question of denying religion. The candidate was indeed expected to be nearly as admirable as the missionary, not only morally but also physically, for he must not be ugly or suffer from any obvious deformity, nor must he have any of the physiognomic features supposed to indicate defects of character. At least for the more advanced initiations, the master of ceremonies must be at least 40 years of age, for Ismailis younger than this were not allowed to pass on secret knowledge. At least 2 witnesses, as well as an assistant, had to be present, and the assistant must also be at least 40 years old, not to mention handsome, eloquent, pleasant, patient, and so forth. The initiation ceremony was elaborate and included numerous symbolic acts, again reminiscent of Masonic ritual. From Ismaili texts of the time, there emerges a picture of Ismailism that is very different from that painted by its Sunni critics. Ismailism appears to have been a serious attempt to raise human consciousness to a higher plane. Whether this is possible at all, and if so, whether the Ismaili method was a good one for achieving that goal, are open questions, but at least we can say that the Ismailis were not the irreligious libertines they are often represented as being. Far from offering its adepts a holiday from morality, the Ismaili proclamation, as it was called, summoned people to a dedicated life of service and self-improvement. It promised a great deal, but the way was hard and the goal was a wholly spiritual one. Who were the Ismailis? The development of Ismailism must surely be one of the strangest phenomena in the history of religion. What started as a secret or semi-secret organization acquired a capital city and an empire, and yet, in spite of its great temporal success, it preserved its inner mystery. For in spite of all that has been written about the Ismailis, both in their own time and later, there is still much that we don't know and probably never shall know. Even when Ismailism became a state religion, it continued to have an important esoteric aspect, and the secret has still not been completely unveiled. For further details of these esoteric ideas, please refer to the appendices. The Ismailis were based in Cairo and claimed descent from Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad. After his death in 632 CE, Islam was ruled in succession by 4 orthodox caliphs, the last of whom was Ali, the Prophet's cousin and Fatima's husband. Ali found himself embroiled in bitter struggles concerning the succession, and eventually he was murdered at the door of the mosque in Kufa. Not long after this, his son Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet, was killed in a battle in which he was enormously outnumbered. This led to the great schism in Islam between the Shia, which means party of Ali, and the Sunni. The Shiites are still passionately devoted to Hussein's memory, and passion plays to commemorate his martyrdom are performed annually in Iran. Today, Iran is Shiite, but in the 11th century it was officially Sunni. The Shiites regard Ali as the first imam. The imam is a spiritual authority of enormous prestige. Indeed, within some of the Shiite sects, he takes on quasi-divine status. The imamate is passed on from father to son, but the succession of visible imams became broken at some point in the past, and the imam is now hidden. This much is agreed by all, but there are differences of opinion about the details of the succession. The main body of the Shiites think that there were 12 visible imams and are therefore called Twelvers, but others regard Ismail as the 7th and last visible imam, and are accordingly known as Ismailis, or Seveners. This dispute within Shi'ism occurred before the foundation of Cairo, which was accomplished early in the 10th century by the Fatimids, who were probably Iranians. They claimed descent from Fatima. The authenticity of this claim has been questioned, but at least one modern historian, Bernard Lewis, thinks it was probably genuine. When Ubaydullah, the first Fatimid caliph, died in 934, he was succeeded by Qaim, who is supposed to have been his son. However, Lewis suggests that he was really descended from Ismail. There is support for this romantic idea from secret Ismaili works and from the Druze scriptures. The Druze, a Syrian sect, were a later offshoot from the Ismaili tradition. As a result of these events, by the end of the 10th century, there was established in Egypt a reborn imamate, claiming descent from Ali and Fatima via Ismail. This was a source to which Ismailis could look for guidance and inspiration. From this center, missionaries were sent out to the rest of the Muslim world, but especially to Iran, which was thought most likely to be receptive to Ismailism. Hassan, usually known by the sobriquet Hassan-i Sabbah, Hassan the Sevener, was one of these. Hassan-i Sabbah and the revolt against the Turks. Many Ismail missionaries and many Ismaili intellectuals in Cairo were Iranians, so it was natural that there should be a determined effort to spread Ismailism in Iran. However, the Seljuk Turkish conquest made this more difficult, for the Seljuks were deeply hostile to Ismailism. Nevertheless, the Ismailis by no means lost heart. Indeed, if anything, they became more ambitious. Ismaili cells were to be found in many cities and towns throughout the country, proselytizing and making converts. The Ismailis were preparing a revolt against the Seljuks, but they did not intend to form a single army and march to power as the Fatimids had done in Egypt. Given the different situation in Iran, this would hardly have been possible. Rather, they hoped for a multiplicity of risings planned to occur simultaneously, which would deprive the Seljuks of their base and be impossible to crush by virtue of their widespread nature. This revolt would have been essentially urban. But in the 11th century, The plan was to take on a different character, with a shift in emphasis from town to country. This development occurred thanks to Hassan-i Sabbah. Hassan was born at Qom, still today a major Shiite religious center, and was brought up as a 12er. His youth and early manhood, however, were spent at Ray, now a suburb of Tehran, which was Sunni at the time. He was an earnest seeker after truth, and is said to have been passionately fond of study from the age of 7, a significant age, becoming learned in mathematics, astronomy, and therefore astrology, and occult matters. At about the age of 17, he encountered an Ismaili missionary called Amir Zarab. No doubt a young man of Hassan's ability seemed a fine prize, and Amir Zarab tried hard to convert him, but Hassan was not convinced. Nevertheless, after Amir Zarab's departure, Hassan continued to read Ismaili books, and his mind was troubled. Then, as often seems to have happened in the lives of medieval people, his conversion was brought about by a near-fatal illness. Alarmed at the possibility that he might die without having realized the truth, he sought out another Ismaili, nicknamed the Saddler, and asked for further instruction. Fully convinced at last of the truth of the Ismaili doctrines, he took the oath of allegiance. The senior Ismaili in Iran, Abu Malik of Isfahan, came to Ray soon after this and was impressed by Hassan. He drew him into Ismaili activities and a few years later sent him to Cairo, where he was well received. However, there were political tensions in Cairo at this time, which were to have momentous consequences for Hassan some years later, and there is a suggestion that he got into some kind of difficulty there. In 1080, he returned to Iran, surviving a shipwreck on the Syrian coast in the process, and became very active as an Ismaili propagandist. He traveled extensively, especially in the northwest of the country, and he had a large number of men under his command who covered other areas. He was by now a wanted man, but he evaded his would-be captors and, in 1090, carried out the coup which made him famous and launched the assassins on their romantic career. He gained possession of the castle of Alamut, Hassan at Alamut, 1090-1124. The castle of Alamut was held at this time by a castellan on behalf of the Sultan. Hassan gradually infiltrated his men into the garrison. The castellan got wind of this and pretended to be sympathetic to Ismailism in order to lull the enemy's suspicions. But when he decided to act, it was too late. Hassan had, by this time, entered the castle himself under a pseudonym. The castellan found himself impotent and had to yield possession of the castle to Hassan, who gave him a draft for 3,000 dinars as the price of the castle, to be paid by the governor of Damgan. The castellan, not taking this very seriously, did nothing with the draft for some time, but eventually he found himself short of funds and presented it. To his astonishment, the governor kissed the note reverently and paid him the gold. In the Muslim calendar, the year in which Hassan gained possession of the castle was 483. By a strange coincidence in the Abjad system of number-letter correspondences, this date gives the name of the stronghold, Alamut. This occult correspondence was naturally not lost on the Ismailis, who made much of it. But the name itself is something of a puzzle. It is usually said to mean eagle's teaching, and there is a story that a monarch, out hunting with his falcon, had the rock suggested to him as a suitable place for a castle by seeing his bird land upon it. Another possible meaning is eagle's nest, which seems intuitively more probable. Indeed, one of the first things I saw when I visited the rock in 1966 was an eagle soaring out from the summit. However, at least one authority denies that the name has anything to do with eagles at all. Whether or not the name Alamut is connected with eagles, there is undoubtedly something aquiline about the character of Hassan, whom I cannot help picturing as a gaunt figure with piercing eyes and a great beak of a nose. From his eyrie in Alamut, he made himself respected and feared throughout much of Iran, and he successfully resisted all attempts to dislodge him. He seems to have built new fortifications on the rock, and is said to have constructed vast store chambers for grain, honey, and water. Owing to the thoroughness with which the Mongols destroyed the castle, we have no accurate information about this work. One of the most puzzling questions is how the castle was supplied with water. At present, the stream that supplies the fields of Qasir Khan at the foot of the rock does not flow anywhere near the castle, though possibly its course was different 900 years ago. There are stories of water being brought in lead pipes, but this seems improbable and in any case would not afford any security in a siege. An interesting suggestion put forward by Peter Willey is that the curious channel that can be seen running across the south face of the rock was built to collect rainwater and feed it into chambers cut in the cliff. This does seem possible. At any rate, we can be pretty sure that massive engineering works of some kind were carried out to provide water and were successful, for Alamut held out in the face of several determined attempts to capture it. Hassan became known as a severe and austere ruler. He remained within his house, writing, thinking, and planning. He is said to have gone out only twice, and to have gone up on the roof only once. At one time, when things were difficult, he sent his womenfolk away to another castle, where they had to spin like the other women, and he never brought them back. He had both his sons executed, one for drinking wine, the other on a charge of murder, which later proved false. Von Hammer, the 19th century historian who attributed all kinds of wickedness to the assassins, cited these sentences as evidence of Ismaili depravity and Hassan's want of natural affection, but it seems more plausible to regard them as instances of his impartiality. They also make it clear that in Hassan's time, the Muslim ritual law, Sharia, was enforced at Alamut with full rigor. Under Hassan's leadership, the Ismailis prospered. Other castles were acquired, some by capture, some by purchase or negotiation, and the Ismailis thus came to dominate quite a large area. There also continued to be Ismaili cells in nearly every Iranian city, especially Isfahan, where the Ismailis had acquired a stronghold just outside the city. However, the Isfahan center was captured by the Turks in 1107. The wife of the Ismaili chief decked herself in her jewels and flung herself from the battlements. The chief himself was captured, paraded through the town, and then skinned alive. This left Hassan as undisputed head of the Ismailis in Iran, and the Seljuks mounted a protracted campaign against him. In 1118, Alamut was besieged, and Hassan had a hard time persuading his followers not to surrender. But at that moment, news came of the death of the Sultan. Despite the commander's pleas, the army dispersed, and Alamut was saved. The use of terror. The name assassin is, of course, synonymous with political murder. In 1092, the famous statesman Nizam al-Mulk was on his way to Baghdad when he was approached from a youth from Dalam, the region of Alamut, in the guise of a suppliant. The man suddenly drew a knife from his robe and wounded the minister fatally. This is generally supposed to have been the first assassination carried out by Hassan's orders. The Ismailis claimed it was done to avenge the death of a carpenter, but an elaborate legend has grown up about it, linking Hassan, Nizam al-Mulk, and the poet Omar Khayyam. According to the story, Hassan and Omar Khayyam are supposed to have been fellow students of Nizam al-Mulk, and the three agreed that whichever of them should gain a powerful position first should help the others. When Nizam al-Mulk eventually rose to be vizier under Malik Shah, Omar Khayyam declined any office and asked only for a pension, but Hassan demanded a place at court. Here he did so well that he seemed likely to outshine Nizam al-Mulk himself. The Sultan asked Nizam al-Mulk to prepare a general account of state revenues. Nizam al-Mulk said the task would take 2 years, but Hassan said he could do it in only a few weeks. Hassan, naturally, was given the commission and was provided with all the necessary facilities. But when the day came for him to present his figures, he was forestalled by the wily Nizam al-Mulk, who managed to sabotage his papers and poured scorn on him when he became confused. Hassan was thus disgraced and had to leave court, and this discomfiture was the motive for his ultimate revenge. This romantic tale is almost certainly one of the many legends that have accumulated around Hassan-i Sabbah. That this is so is evident from chronology. Omar Khayyam and Hassan died at almost the same time, 1123 and 1124 respectively, whereas Nizam al-Mulk was born in 1017 and moreover seems to have finished his education and entered public life at an early age. If Hassan and Omar Khayyam had been Nizam al-Mulk's fellow students, therefore, they must have both been centenarians when they died, which is possible but unlikely. Even though the story is almost certainly apocryphal, however, it does seem that Hassan and Nizam al-Mulk met before Hassan's visit to Egypt. The vizier evidently knew a good deal about Hassan, since, as we have seen, he ordered his arrest. There are thus straightforward reasons why Hassan should have wanted Nizam al-Mulk out of the way. As for the legend, it may be that Nizam al-Mulk has been confused with a later, less famous vizier, who almost certainly did meet Hassan when both men were students. This minister, Anushirvan ibn Khalid, says that he met and studied with some of the chief Ismaili leaders, especially a man of Ray, who traveled throughout the world and whose profession was that of a secretary. This was almost certainly Hassan-i Sabbah. Although the legend seems untenable in its full-blown form, it leaves open the intriguing possibility that Hassan and Omar Khayyam were fellow students. Unfortunately, we know too little about the lives of both men to say anything definite about this. But it may be significant that Omar Khayyam has been said to be an Ismaili. Murder as a political weapon was not, of course, an Ismaili invention, and indeed it appears that a number of groups in Iran were making use of it at the time. The Ismailis, however, undoubtedly took the trend further than most. They may have believed that it was more humane to kill one man selectively than a multitude in a battle. In any case, given the fact that they were so enormously outnumbered by their enemies, terrorism was a logical enough expedient. It is usually said that a special corps of assassins, the Fidais, existed, but this is doubtful, at least until a much later date. Marco Polo, who visited the site of Alamut in the 13th century after its destruction by the Mongols, relates the romantic legend of how the Fidais were trained by the Grand Master. The Old Man, as Marco Polo calls him, following the Crusader usage, was said to have constructed a fantastic pleasure garden, flowing with wine, honey, milk, and water, and populated by beautiful women. This was a representation of paradise as described in the Quran. The Old Man was supposed to drug his future assassins and bring them unconscious into the garden. After a time, they were once again rendered insensible and brought out into the ordinary world. They were thus convinced that they had been given a foretaste of the joys to come if they obeyed the Old Man's orders, which they naturally did unquestioningly, certain that they would once more find themselves in paradise after their death. It need hardly be said that this is a total fantasy. There is no need to suppose that any such elaborate method of preparation was needed. Like other Muslim soldiers, the assassins would be told and would unquestioningly believe that if they were killed, they would go straight to paradise. A similar belief motivates modern suicide bombers among the Palestinians and other minority groups who lack other means of getting at their enemies. Death on an assassination mission was counted a great honor by the Ismailis. There is an often repeated story of the mother of a Fidai who rejoiced greatly and put on her best clothes when she heard that her son had been killed on a mission, but changed into mourning when he came home safely after all. The Fidais were at least not underhand in their assassinations. They did not poison their victims or stab them in the back in dark alleys, but killed them openly in public. A favorite occasion seems to have been at Friday prayers in the mosque. Publicity, in fact, was an important part of their aim, and they were successful in attaining this. Prominent men took to wearing armor under their clothes, and sometimes the Ismailis could achieve their purpose merely by a threat. Sultan Sanjar made a truce with Alamut, persuaded, it is said, by a dagger thrust into the ground next to his pillow. and an amusing story concerns a professor of theology who made a practice of reviling the heretics of Alamut. At length, one of his students, who had impressed him by the attention he paid to his lectures, revealed himself as a fidei and offered the professor alternative inducements to mend his ways: a dagger or a bag of gold. The professor wisely chose the gold, and when subsequently twitted about the reason for his changed attitude to the Ismailis, he replied that he had been convinced of his error by arguments that were both weighty and pointed. Assassination as a political weapon may be hard to justify morally, although what about the bomb plot to kill Hitler? And certainly it was this practice that made the Ismailis' name so execrated among both Muslims and Christians. Even so, one cannot help sensing the intensity of their devotion to their cause and the feeling of comradeship that inspired their heroism. For heroism it was. Few fideis survived, and their deaths were seldom easy. The split with Cairo. At the end of the 11th century, there were disturbances in Cairo that had far-reaching effects on Iranian Ismailism. A dispute occurred concerning the succession of the imamate. This was very much a rerun of the earlier dispute that had divided the Seveners from the Twelvers. The Fatimid Caliph Mustansir had designated his eldest son, Nizar, as the next imam, and according to Ismaili tradition, this decision could not be revoked. But towards the end of his reign, Mustansir lost control of his empire, and effective power passed to an army officer called Badr al-Jamali. When Mustansir died in 1094, Badr's son Afdal, who was now in effective control, put another of Mustansir's sons, Mustali, on the throne. Nizar, not surprisingly, objected, and a brief civil war ensued, but Nizar was defeated, imprisoned, and eventually executed. The Cairo Ismailis now accepted Mustali as imam, but the Ismailis in Iran, led by Hassan-i Sabbah, remained loyal to Nizar, and in so doing broke away from the political and spiritual tutelage of the Fatimids and launched forth on their own strange course. From this time, they were generally known as Nizaris. We do not know the reasons for this decision, though personal loyalty to Nizar does not seem to have been important. Perhaps Hassan had come into conflict with Badr in Cairo, as later Nizari accounts suggest, but more probably the motives for the schism were less personal. There were, it is true, genuine doctrinal reasons why the Iranian Ismailis should not accept the revoking of the designation of Nizar as imam, for it was just this question that had led to the separation of the Ismaili sect in the first place. But no doubt politics and national pride entered into it as well. The Iranian Ismailis were fiercely independent, already in revolt against the Turkish invaders, and probably unenthusiastic about owning allegiance to a foreign power, especially since Badr's troops, on whom he relied for his position, were largely Turkish. Whatever the exact reasons for the break, Hassan's authority ensured that it was generally accepted among the Iranian Ismailis, who henceforth were pretty well universally adherents of Nizar. And though there was at first some dissent in Syria, before long the Syrian Ismailis too were loyal to the new dispensation. Allegiance to Nizar raised an important practical question, however. Where was the imam? After Nizar's death, there was no obvious successor, but it was a central part of the Ismaili position that there must always be an imam somewhere, otherwise everything would fall to pieces. For the moment, the imam was regarded as hidden. Later, he was to stage a most dramatic reappearance. One might have expected that Hassan himself would claim to be the imam, but he never did so. And indeed, it is said that when his followers wrote up a fanciful genealogy for him, he threw it contemptuously in the river, remarking that he would rather be the imam's favored servant than his degenerate son. The title generally applied to Hassan was Hujjah, proof. This was the name of a high rank in the Ismaili hierarchy and signified a senior missionary responsible for a particular territory. But the title could also refer to someone who served as a link with a more exalted level in the hierarchy. Hujjah could be applied to Hassan in this sense as well, and eventually he seems to have been regarded as the Imam's official representative. Until the end of his long life, Hassan remained in Alamut, a lonely and severe figure, administering his strange realm, ordering assassinations, thinking, writing, planning, and waiting. For what? Did he believe that a son of the dead Nizar would one day appear to claim the imamate? If so, how was he to be recognized as genuine? Or had Hassan perhaps given up all hope of finding a physical imam, and now conceived of the imam as existing on a spiritual, though nonetheless real, plane of existence? My own guess, for it can be nothing more, is that the last possibility is the most likely. The Hassan whose character has come down to us is very far from naive, and he is totally uncompromising in his rejection of makeshift, second-best solutions. Such a man must surely have realized that no genuine imam was likely to appear in the foreseeable future, and that all the Nizaris could do was to preserve the imamate as an idea. The most reliable information we have suggests that this was Hassan's position, and that in his time there was no specific teaching at Alamut about when or how the imam would appear. Indeed, even Hassan's second successor, Muhammad the Farsaf, issued coins bearing simply the name of Nizar, with no suggestion of the existence of any later imam. To the modern mind, it may be tempting to suppose that Hassan was merely cynical and used the legend of the vanished imam for his own purposes, while himself disbelieving in it. But this, I think, would be totally to misconceive the medieval outlook in general and Hassan's character in particular. All that we know of, Hassan suggests that he was wholly sincere in his beliefs, and I am sure it would be a complete mistake to discount them. There is something almost Ciceronian about Hassan, an unyielding firmness and integrity which, though it may not inspire our affection, cannot but compel our respect. Hassan wrote a great deal, but little of what he wrote has come down to us. His style was characteristically terse. From what can be surmised about his teaching, it seems to have differed somewhat, at least in emphasis, from that of the Fatimid Ismailis. The literature from Cairo contained much mystical speculation about the nature of the imam. Hassan's imam is more of an authoritarian figure who seems to be as much a ruler and a lawgiver as a mystagogue. Probably this change in emphasis was partly due to the situation of the Nizaris in Iran. They were broken up and scattered in small groups throughout the country, and there was a need for strong leadership from Alamut if they were to maintain their cohesion. No doubt, too, men tended to cast the imam in their own image, and Hassan seems to have been by nature as well as by necessity a stern disciplinarian, so that his version of the imam's character was a severe one. Hassan's immediate successors, Hassan-i Sabbah, died in 1124. It is said that he concealed his fatal illness to the last, a piece of austerity that accords well with what we know of his character. He was always renowned for his laconicness. He was succeeded by his lieutenant, Kia Bozorg Umid, Kia Great Hope. By now, the Nizaris were ceasing to be an important power in the cities and were becoming an enclave within the Seljuk state. The Seljuks had for some 20 years largely ceased hostilities against the Nizaris. Soon after the accession of Bozorg Umid, warfare broke out again, but the Nizaris held their own. They were also responsible for a number of assassinations, including that of the Abbasid Caliph Mustarshid, who was at the time a prisoner of the Seljuks. At a more local level, fighting went on intermittently with the neighboring city of Qazvin. Bozorg Umid, though evidently able enough militarily, seems not to have contributed anything to the community intellectually, and in this respect the Nizaris don't seem to have been very active during the rules of either Bozorg Umid or his son and successor, Muhammad I, who came to power in 1138. By this time, the Nizari state had settled into its own pattern of existence, with a hereditary succession of rulers. An early event in Muhammad I's reign was the assassination of Caliph Rashid, son of the Caliph Mustarshid, who had been assassinated earlier. Rashid was under house arrest in Isfahan at the time. Great celebrations were held in Alamut on this occasion, but the people of Isfahan took revenge by massacring anyone who they thought was an Ismaili. Warfare with the Seljuks continued under Muhammad I, though at a reduced intensity, and the Nizaris captured a number of new fortresses. But all this activity was relatively petty, and there was beginning to be an increasing discrepancy between the original high hopes of the community and what had actually been achieved. Before long, however, the situation was to change dramatically, and the Nizaris' patience was to reap an unlooked-for reward: the resurrection at Alamut. In this chapter, we encounter the central event in the story of the Assassins of Alamut, and an extraordinary event it was. By the middle of the 12th century, the third generation of Nizaris was reaching adulthood. A certain restlessness was in the air. The community was well established now and seemed immune from any serious external danger, for the Seljuks had done their worst and failed, and there was as yet no other great power to offer a threat. So far as the outer world was concerned, the position was a stalemate. But the Nizaris had never forgotten that they were a spiritual elite, and their sense of their importance had, if anything, been enhanced by their separation from Cairo. However, they were at this time relatively inactive. They were simply waiting. But for what? Hassan-i Sabbah seems to have implied that he and his successors were the representatives of the absent imam, who would one day appear to claim his inheritance and lead his people to victory. That was probably enough for the Nizaris of Hassan's day, but as the years passed, it ceased to be so. Besides, Hassan's successors, though able enough as military and political leaders, lacked Hassan's intellectual gifts. They don't appear to have written anything, and there is little evidence of any great spiritual ferment during their reigns. At first, no doubt, the Nizaris had little time to think about such matters, being too preoccupied with ensuring their own survival. But once this seemed assured, they began to yearn to return to the old Ismaili habit of metaphysical speculation. A further source of dissatisfaction was the strict discipline imposed by the first three masters of Alamut. Hassan-i Sabbah had set the tone in this respect, and both Bozorg Umid and Muhammad I followed his lead. The Islamic ritual law was enforced in its full rigor by all three. This was nothing new for the Ismailis. In Cairo, too, the Fatimids had emphasized the need to observe the outward forms of religion, as well as the importance of understanding its hidden depths. But by the time Muhammad I came to power in Alamut, the emphasis seems to have come to be on the outward aspects at the partial expense of inner truth. All this was reversed, however, by Muhammad I's son, Hassan II. Hassan was an able and learned young man of great personal charm. He had made a deep study of the older Ismaili literature, but was also attracted by Sufism. He was to fuse these two traditions in a bold new synthesis. During his father's lifetime, Hassan concealed his ideas as far as possible, but his eloquence and personality gave him a strong influence among the younger Nizaris, and this excited his father's suspicions. It is also said that he drank wine in secret. It's interesting how often this theme emerges in the accounts of the Ismaili rulers, and one can never be sure if it is to be understood literally or metaphorically. The same is true of much classical Persian poetry, notably that of Hafiz, and it seems that wine, the forbidden gateway to altered states of consciousness, had a symbolic significance for Muslims that it lacked for Christians. For Hassan's contemporaries, the idea that he drank wine implied that he was above the law, and from this it was but a short step to think that he might be the imam. In an effort to counteract these dangerous ideas, Muhammad called a public meeting, at which he pointed out that the imamate was hereditary. Since he himself was not the imam, his son could not be either. Hassan publicly denied that he was the imam, but the Ismailis were accustomed to the idea of dissimulation of truth, and many of them refused to accept the denial. Muhammad had 250 of these dissidents executed and made a further 250 carry the corpses away on their backs as they went into exile. But Hassan was merely biding his time. When his father died in 1162, Hassan was about 35 years old. In his brief life, he was to bring about an almost complete change in the pattern of Nizari development, not merely in Alamut, but throughout all the Nizari territories, including Syria. It was an astonishingly bold coup that Hassan had in mind, and he took his time in preparing for it. For the first 2.5 years of his reign, he did little. He merely relaxed the oppressive restrictions at Alamut and refrained from punishing those who broke the ritual law. He also released a number of captives who had been held at Alamut. Then in 1164, he acted. It was the 17th day of Ramadan, the Muslim month of fasting. He summoned his people from all the Nizari territories in Iran and assembled them at the foot of the rock. It was a grand occasion. The people were arranged in groups according to the districts from which they came, and a pulpit had been set up. This faced towards Mecca, so that the audience had their backs towards Mecca. At each corner of the pulpit a flag was set: white, red, yellow, the Fatimid color, and green, the color of the Prophet. At about noon, when all the people were assembled, Hassan came down from the fortress. He was dressed in white and wore a white turban. He ascended the pulpit and addressed the audience. Speaking first in Persian, he announced that someone had come to him in secret from the imam and had brought him a message, which he proceeded to deliver. We don't have the text of this, but we know its general sense. "The imam of our time," Hassan proclaimed, "sends you blessings and compassion, for you are his special servants. And therefore he has lifted from you the burden of obeying the ritual law and has brought you the resurrection, Qiyamah." Hassan now changed from Persian to Arabic, which was of course unknown to most of his audience, but an interpreter had been placed at the foot of the pulpit to give a running translation. Apparently the audience took the Arabic speech for the direct word of the imam. Its essence was that Hassan was the imam's representative and mouthpiece, and all Nizaris must obey him in everything, for his word and the imam's were one. The full boldness of Hassan's coup may be lost on modern readers, especially those with a Christian background. For Muslims, church and state are indivisible, and the ritual law is the civil law. Hassan had therefore abrogated the religious law and the civil law simultaneously, and had done so in the most dramatic manner possible by publicly breaking the fast of Ramadan. From now on, the only law the Nizaris were to acknowledge was the word of the imam, which in practice meant the word of Hassan himself. At this stage, Hassan does not seem to have claimed that he himself was the imam, though he apparently did so later, or at least allowed it to be tacitly assumed. Even if he did not make the claim, his devoted followers doubtless soon made it for him. After all, this idea had been current among them even during the lifetime of Muhammad I. So great was Hassan's authority that his reform was accepted with little question throughout his territories. He allowed no hesitation on this score, and it's said that he at least proposed the death penalty for anyone who refused the new dispensation. But there don't seem to have been many such, and Hassan was so loved by his people that he came to be known simply as Allah Dikri Salam, on his mentioned peace. But he was not loved by everyone. Among those who rejected the new ideas, in their hearts at least, was Hassan's own brother-in-law, Hassan-i Sabbah. Jealousy may have played a part, for Hussein came from a family which at one time had been locally powerful. 18 months after the proclamation of the resurrection, he murdered Hassan at the castle of Lamassar. Probably he intended to reverse Hassan's reforms and return the Nizaris to Islamic orthodoxy, but he was given no chance to do so. Muhammad II, Hassan's son, though only 19 at his father's death, was capable and determined and fully in sympathy with the ideas of the resurrection. He took power, executed Hassan-i Sabbah and all his family, and over the subsequent 44 years devoted himself to working out the philosophical and doctrinal implications of the resurrection. The boldest step taken by the new ruler was to claim to be the Imam. Hassan II, as we have seen, had probably also claimed to be the Imam, but only spiritually. Certainly there was nothing impossible about the idea of such a spiritual descent from an Ismaili point of view. But Muhammad's position was more extreme, for he claimed that his father was actually descended physically from Nizar. The official version of how this came about seems to have been that Nizar's grandson had been brought to Hassan-i Sabbah secretly and had grown up under his protection in the village of Qasir Khan at the foot of the rock. Hassan II was supposed to be a descendant of this grandson, though the exact details of how he came to appear to be the son of Muhammad the Firme were left vague. They are filled in, somewhat scandalously, by the violently anti-Ismaili historian Juvaini, who gives two alternative versions which he says were current in Alamut. The first version is that the Imam was living incognito in Qasir Khan. He had a son at the same time as the Lord of Alamut, and an old woman exchanged the babies secretly, hiding them under her chador, veil. Apart from the fact that women in Qasir Khan don't wear chadors today, and probably didn't then, the story derives from a well-known folklore motif, and is obviously legendary. It may well have been current among the people of the valley. The alternative version is less edifying. It is that the Imam committed adultery with Muhammad's wife. Muhammad found out and killed the Imam, but the Imam's son was born. In support of this story, Juvaini says that the people used to dishonor the grave of Muhammad the First. Although the Imam would doubtless be regarded as above the law and therefore entitled to behave in this manner, it seems possible that this version is a later fabrication by the Nizaris' enemies. Is it conceivable that Hassan II was really descended from Nizar? It seems extremely unlikely, yet, as we have seen, a rather similar sequence of events may have led to the founding of the Fatimid dynasty. It is therefore just possible that history repeated itself at Alamut. On the other hand, we do know that the Ismailis recognized the possibility of a spiritual succession of the imamate, and on the whole, this is the more likely explanation for what happened at Alamut. The whole emphasis of Nizari thought at the time of the resurrection was on inner, esoteric interpretation. Probably all the rather literal-minded attempts to produce a Fatimid genealogy for Hassan II were intended mainly for the less sophisticated among the faithful, while the more esoteric conception of a spiritual descent was reserved for the more intellectual members of the community. The doctrine of the resurrection. Hassan did not live long enough to work out the full implications of his momentous announcement. That task was left to his son. We are told that Muhammad wrote a great deal, using the style of the Greek philosophers. Like his father, therefore, he was an intellectual. Unfortunately, none of his writings have come down to us, and the best that can be done is to piece the ideas together from a variety of sources, some of which are from a later time. The essence of the resurrection, Qiyamah, is that it was the fulfillment of the long-established Ismaili expectation of the millennium. Ismaili eschatology had always predicted that the Imam of the resurrection would come to usher in the rule of righteousness, when Ismailis would no longer have to dissimulate by obeying the ritual law. Now that longed-for day had finally dawned. Clearly, however, it had not done so in quite the way that the older Ismaili authors had expected. The resurrection was supposed to be a cataclysmic event on a world scale, but now the world went on just as before. Indeed, outside the Ismaili territories, the great proclamation was almost unknown. But for the Nizaris themselves, everything had changed. They were now living in a new age. But since everything on the physical level went on just as before, the change must be internal and spiritual. The resurrection meant, in fact, the dawning of a new phase of consciousness. These ideas are developed at greater length in the appendices, to which you should refer if interested. The esoteric interpretation of religion had always been fundamental to Ismailism, but under the Fatimids, the teaching was that both aspects, esoteric and exoteric, must be given full weight. If you remained at the exoteric level, you could never hope to advance spiritually, but this didn't mean that the exoteric religious forms had no importance. In a metaphor used by Abu Firas, chapter 4, the exoteric aspect is the shell of the egg, which protects the yolk, the delicate truths hidden within. The Nizaris of the resurrection, however, threw away not just the shell of the egg, but the white as well, and concentrated all their attention on the yolk, the secret of secrets. Nizarism thus came to be pure esotericism made into a state religious doctrine. The whole of Nizari spiritual life centered on the Imam, who was divine, a manifestation of God. In a sense, of course, this was nothing new, for the Ismailis had always regarded the Imam in this light. But for the Nizaris, the Imam had been hidden for a century and a half. None of them had ever been in his presence before. Now he was once again among his devotees, and their excitement must have been almost boundless. Moreover, the relationship of the Nizaris to their Imam was quite different from that of the inhabitants of Cairo to the Fatimid Caliph. Cairo was a large city, where the Caliph lived in a palace surrounded by officials and guards, so that few of his followers can ever have seen him or heard him speak. Alamut, on the other hand, was small and rural, and the population of all the Nizari territories put together must have been much smaller than that of Egypt. No doubt almost every Iranian Nizari, at least those living in or near the Alamut Valley, could see and hear the Imam. These things made the Nizaris' devotion to their Imam a practical and personal affair, and no doubt heightened its intensity to an extraordinary degree. But there was also something else. The Nizari Imam was no ordinary Imam, but was the Imam of the resurrection. In him, the whole elaborate Ismaili cosmology found its fulfillment. The Ismailis conceived of creation as composed of a number of levels, and spiritual enlightenment consisted in moving upwards from level to level. All the Imam's followers would now ascend with him to the next higher level in the cosmic hierarchy. Indeed, they were there already, without having to die first. The resurrection was thus an event of literally world-shaking importance. Awareness of these momentous events must in itself have been enough to bring many of the Nizaris to something like ecstasy, but was there more to it? I have already said that there are important similarities between Ismailism and Sufism, and it seems likely that the Nizaris of this period were making use of techniques for inducing altered states of consciousness like those employed by the Sufis, including chanting and the inward repetition of the name of God. Hassan II certainly, and Muhammad II very probably, were interested in Sufism. The rumors about the Nizaris' use of hashish may be relevant here. Perhaps these reflect a distorted version of their use of meditational techniques, or perhaps they really did use hashish or other drugs as a means of inducing altered states of awareness. When E.G. Browne, the 19th century Persian scholar, visited Iran at the end of the last century, he found that hashish was held in such superstitious awe that it was seldom referred to openly, but was designated by code names such as Master Sayyid or the Parrot of Mysteries. This fear of the drug cannot plausibly be attributed to its hallucinogenic properties, since the more potent opium was widely smoked at the time and was not referred to in these oblique ways. More likely, the use of code names points to a folk memory of a link between hashish and the feared Nizaris. If I am right in supposing that the Nizaris made use of various methods for altering consciousness, we could infer that the combination of these techniques with the state of excitement caused by Hassan's announcement of the resurrection would have had an immensely powerful psychological effect. One set of influences would reinforce the other. The meditational techniques would act like a lens, focusing the Nizaris' devotion to their Imam into a white heat that was intense enough to transmute the consciousness of some of them, at least, into a new condition. This would go far to explain the impression of enthusiasm which filters down to us even through the fragmentary records that have survived. Something important happened at Alamut, and whatever it was momentous enough to make the Nizaris believe, at least for a time, that they had indeed experienced the resurrection that Ismaili eschatology predicted. What I am suggesting in short is that under Hassan II and Muhammad II, there grew up at Alamut a mystical school similar to those that were developing at the time among the Sufis and making use of techniques like those of the Sufis. The difference, however, was that the Nizari's spiritual leader was no ordinary human sheikh, but the divine imam himself. At first glance, it may seem puzzling that the Nizaris do not appear to have made much of the murder of Hassan II. One might have expected that he would become a Nizari martyr, as Ali's son Hussein did for the Shiites. The explanation, I think, is to be found in the way the Ismailis conceived of the imam. They believed that the subtle body of the imam is immune from harm even if his physical body is killed. Since Hassan was the imam, he could not really be killed, so there was no reason to be excessively despondent about his death. The imam lived on in Muhammad II, who was in his essential nature identical with his father. Life in the resurrection. The Ismaili state before the resurrection had had many grades of membership, but after the resurrection all this was swept away, since it belonged to the past. Henceforth there were only three possibilities, three levels of being or non-being. The first level is that of the people of opposition, meaning all those who rejected the imam and his teaching. Even in the old dispensation, these had been regarded as bound for hell. Now they were simply obliterated, held to be non-existent. Since God is the only reality, there can be nothing outside him or in opposition to him, so if anyone appears to be in opposition, they must merely be a kind of optical illusion. While they are supposedly alive, they have a kind of provisional or illusory existence, like that of a mirage, but when they die, they disappear utterly and vanish into that nothingness which they have been in all along. The second level is occupied by the people of order. These are the Ismailis, living and dead, who are not participants in the resurrection. They are called people of order because they cling to the elaborate Ismaili hierarchical scheme. They too, it seems, are non-existent. The assignment of the dead Ismailis to non-existence seems rather harsh, though they may possibly have been saved by an old teaching that the doctrine and truth of one imam have no necessary application to those of any other. The general idea, however, is clear. The old Ismaili hierarchy is superseded, and those who cling to it are hardly better off than outright unbelievers. Only the third group, the people of union, is saved. They are the ones who have grasped something at least of the truth of the Imam of the resurrection and are striving to unite themselves fully to him. It is in principle open to people in the other two groups to see the light and join the people of union, but we don't get the impression that the Nizaris spent much time or effort in trying to convert non-Ismailis, who were presumably regarded as too non-existent to be worth troubling about. The inhabitants of the Nizari territories in Iran and Syria were expected to participate in the resurrection, and in most cases they did so. We do not know how many old-style Ismailis there were in Iran at this time, or what their reaction to the new teaching was. The new teaching was supposed to have literally cosmic reverberations. The events at Alamut were thought to have vast significance, set against the Ismaili cosmology of cyclical time. All space and all time were focused on the Rock of Alamut on that fateful 17th day of Ramadan when the resurrection was proclaimed. There was nothing accidental about the date. It was predetermined from eternity. There were elaborate esoteric teachings concerning time, which was conceived of as cyclical. See the appendices for more details of these ideas. With the resurrection, we touch the high point of the story of Alamut and perhaps of the whole Ismaili venture. The resurrection was to produce a fascinating offshoot in Syria, which I shall describe in the next chapter. But in Alamut, the excitement dies away somewhat after the death of Muhammad II, and the Nizaris begin the long decline, which was to end in the general catastrophe of the Mongol invasion. Long before then, however, the original creative impulse had spent itself. Yet that there was a strong and genuine impulse at the beginning is hard to doubt. We, who must perforce try to understand the resurrection through fragmentary written descriptions across the gulf of 7 centuries, can only guess at what it meant in terms of inner experience. But there is no doubt that the inner experience was what mattered. The Nizaris were asked to shift to a new state of being, and for a time at least, they believed that they had done so, that they were actually living in a transformed world. This idea may seem ridiculous if we contrast the grandiose nature of their claims with the political reality outside. The rest of the world went on as before, untroubled by the fact that it had now ceased to exist. To look at the matter in this way, however, is to miss the point as the Nizaris saw it. For them, time itself had come to an end with the proclamation of the resurrection. It was a magnificent answer to the failure of a military undertaking. The enemy was simply annihilated. In the end, of course, the dream could not last. Muhammad's successor, Hassan III, brought the community, kicking and screaming, back into the real world by reinstating the Islamic ritual law. But even if he had not done so, the vision would have crumbled and dissolved at last, as has every other attempt to create the perfect society on earth. But probably the Nizari state was particularly unstable because of the basis on which it was founded. Almost every long-lasting mystical tradition we know of seems to have existed against a background of exoteric religion. Sufi masters, for example, expected their pupils to have fulfilled the requirements of Orthodox Islam before undertaking the esoteric practices of Sufism. In the case of Ismailism itself, the parent regime in Egypt always emphasized the need for observation of the exoteric aspects of Islam as well as for study of the esoteric aspects. Nizarism at the period of the resurrection was an anomaly in that it abandoned the exoteric forms altogether and concentrated wholly on the esoteric side of Ismailism. This may have been its undoing. The Ismaili doctrine, taken undiluted, proved in the end too strong a medicine.
We offer you deep historical information from history on YouTube channel. Subscribe. Now don't forget to turn on notifications.